Hi, my name is Tina, and I'm 34 years old. I'm just an ordinary woman who loves getting my hands dirty in the soil. I've been obsessed with gardening since I was a child. While other girls were playing with dolls, I was digging holes in my mom's backyard, trying to plant whatever I could get my hands on. My parents thought it was just a temporary thing, but it never went away. When I turned 18, I knew exactly what I wanted to study. I went to college, where I studied landscape design and horticulture. My parents weren't thrilled. They kept asking me if I was sure I didn't want to be a teacher or a nurse like the other girls. But I persevered. I enjoyed all the classes, even the boring ones about soil composition and plant diseases. After graduating, I worked for several years for other landscaping companies. I learned a lot, but I always felt like I could do something better. My bosses were kind enough, but they didn't have the same passion I had. They rushed the job, used cheap plants, and cut corners wherever they could. It drove me crazy. When I turned 25, I took the plunge. I spent all my savings starting my own landscaping company. It was terrifying. I had no idea if I'd get hired, especially as a young woman in a male-dominated industry. But I figured I had nothing to lose. The first year was brutal. I barely covered gas and groceries. I did everything myself. Marketing, bookkeeping, all the physical labor. My hands were constantly covered in cuts and blisters. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. and work until dark 7 days a week. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I'd made a mistake. But gradually, things began to change. My first clients were happy and recommended me to their friends. In this business, word of mouth is king. It wasn't a cheap choice, but I did it well, listened to people's wishes, and didn't compromise. By 28, my business was thriving enough that I could afford to hire a part-time assistant. I was earning decent money and for the first time in my adult life, felt stable. That's when I started thinking about buying a house. I'd been renting a tiny apartment since college, and I was fed up. I wanted my own home and garden, where I could experiment with different plants and simple designs. I spent months looking at houses, but anything decent was way out of my budget. Finally, I found it. A small house on the outskirts of town with a spacious backyard. The house itself needed some work, but the bones were solid, and the garden had huge potential. The previous owners had let it all go to waste. Weeds everywhere, dead bushes, a lawn that looked like a patch of dirt. But I could imagine what it could turn into. The mortgage payments were tough, but I believed I could handle it by growing my business. I submitted an offer, waited breathlessly for 3 days, and then got the call that it had been accepted. I bounced around the apartment like a little girl. Moving day was one of the happiest days of my life. Nothing special, a simple house with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen, which hadn't been renovated in a while. But it was mine. Well, mine and the bank's money. But still. I immediately got to work in the garden. Every free minute I had was spent there, weeding, planting, laying out paths, and installing benches. It became an obsession. I'd work all day fulfilling clients' orders, and then come home and work in my yard until I lost my sight. The transformation was incredible, and for a long time I couldn't believe that this piece of land, which once seemed dead and helpless, was now breathing and whispering with flowers, as if thanking me for not giving up. In 2 years, I turned a dead patch into something beautiful, breaking up clear sections, a vegetable garden with neat beds, a flower garden where I selected plants so that they would bloom in turns and make the garden alive all year round, a small, narrow edge of greenery by the kitchen window for salads and parsley, and even a pond where fish swam, attracting children from the yard. I meticulously planned every bed and every flower bed, mentally mapping out a palette for the year ahead, so that one plant would yield to another in bloom, creating seamless transitions of color and scent. At night, I returned to the plot to listen to the whispering leaves and check the quiet flickering of the small lights I'd installed for the best view. It was my art and my daily ritual. One day, leafing through a gardening magazine, I saw an ad for a competition for the best small landscape design. Unsure of my own bold impulse, I took photos of the garden early in the morning and on a warm evening, carefully selecting the shots and submitting them. not expecting miracles, because I assumed there would be professional studios with huge budgets. 3 months later, the phone rang so loudly I dropped my spoon, and the voice on the other end said, "You've won first place in the small landscape design category, offering a feature and an interview." I stood there, holding the phone, unable to breathe, because the idea of my garden appearing in a magazine seemed almost unbelievable. But even this fame didn't make me relax. My goal remained the same: pay off my mortgage early, so every extra ruble I earned went toward that goal. I didn't go on vacation or buy unnecessary things, continuing to drive the same battered truck and work 7 days a week, because stability and a roof over my head were more important than fleeting joys. Friends said I was crazy, but I knew this was mine. This was security. When the day came when the last payment left my bank account and the house was truly mine, I bought an expensive chocolate cake and a bottle of good wine and decided to celebrate with my family. My older brother David is 37. He's married to Sarah and they have 2 boys, Leon and Mateo. I've been paying their rent for the past 3 years, so the boys often came into my garden, where their voices and footsteps were as much a part of the property as the paths and bushes. On Saturday, my parents invited us all to dinner. When I walked in, Leon and Mateo were buried in video games. Sarah was complaining, as usual, about the rising rent and the cramped apartment. And my mother, noticing the cake and wine, asked with a slight smile, "What's the treat for?" "I have a surprise for everyone," I replied, my heart pounding loudly and joyfully. We ate, and Sarah kept returning to her topic, complaining and repeatedly tugging at the taut string of pity that my parents couldn't help but feel. But I waited for the right moment, quieted down, looked at them, and calmly said, "I paid the mortgage. The house is now entirely mine." The table was so silent that only the muffled squeak of the game from the living room could be heard, and my mother was the first to extend her hand in acknowledgement. "Oh, how sweet, dear." But her voice was flat and dry, as if spoken from a pre-rehearsed script, and this dispassionate echo somewhat dampened my rapturous joy. David merely chuckled briefly, not looking up from his plate, as if my confession were completely unworthy of his attention, and continued eating as if the conversation had been about something unimportant and insignificant. Sarah's face in a matter of seconds became a living mask, flickering through a dozen emotions. First genuine surprise, then a flash of irritation, followed by a forced smile that resembled false joy, and then the same anger returned, causing her eyes to flash with an unkind fire. "Well, congratulations," she finally managed to say, but her voice was strained, and it was clear from her gaze that she felt no joy for me. And after a moment she couldn't bear it any longer. "Frankly, it even seems unfair. You don't have a husband or children like us. You're just lucky you were able to buy your own house while we were forced to live in a cramped apartment with 2 boys." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, even though a wave of protest was already rising inside me. "The truth is, Sarah, I've been incredibly unlucky," I said quietly. "I've worked day and night, building my company, sacrificing time, relaxation, and everything I could. I've dedicated 9 years of my life to achieving this, and there's not a shred of luck involved." But Sarah abruptly slammed her fork down on her plate, as if to emphasize that she wasn't going to listen to my arguments. "Your family, Tina," her voice grew loud and dramatic, "means your house is family too. David and I have every right to claim it." I froze, stunned by her twisted logic, and struggled to find the words. "It's my property," I finally managed to squeeze out. "No one else has anything to do with it." But Sarah didn't back down, instead starting to sob demonstratively, theatrically covering her face with her hands and turning to David. "Your sister is selfish," she sobbed. "She doesn't even think about our children. Leon and Mateo should grow up in a house with a yard, not in this tiny apartment." And then something I hadn't expected happened. David nodded slowly, as if agreeing with his wife's words. "She's right, Tina," he said calmly, as if it were a matter of course. I glanced at my parents, hoping for support and reason, but my father frowned and said, "Sarah is right, dear. They really do need a home more than you do." My mother merely nodded, adding softly, "Tina, you need to think about the children." I burst out laughing, but my laughter was hollow and bitter. "And where do you think I should live?" I asked, but the answer came instantly. "We'll move into your house," Sarah said confidently, her tears vanishing as if in a flash, "and you can rent an apartment or something." David added, "You make a good living, Tina. You have a high income. You could buy yourself a new house quickly." And then the worst thing happened. All three of them, David, Sarah, and my parents, started discussing my house as if I wasn't even there, as if I died and they were dividing up the inheritance. They talked about who would get which room, how Leon would need a spacious bedroom, how Sarah would finally have a big kitchen, how the boys would have fun playing in the garden I'd created with my own hands. "Tina's living room is so much more spacious than ours," Sarah said enthusiastically, and my mother added, "And her garden, the kids will love it." I sat listening and felt the blood pounding in my temples. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I slammed my palm on the table so hard the plates jumped. "I won't give up my house to anyone!" I screamed and stood up, pushing my chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. "This is my property, my labor, my sacrifices. You have nothing to do with it." They looked at me as if I were crazy, as if I was being unreasonable, refusing to hand over my most precious possession. I grabbed my purse and the bottle of wine I'd brought with me and added, "I don't trust you anymore." "Sit down, Tina," my father said sternly. "We're just trying to do what's best for the family." "Best for the family?" I repeated, looking him straight in the eye. "But what about what's best for me? Have you ever considered how tirelessly I worked for this?" Sarah's whiny voice returned. "Think of Leon and Mateo, they're your nephews." "I've been thinking about them for 3 years, paying your rent," I blurted out and headed for the door. Behind me, the voices continued arguing as if nothing had happened. "She'll come to her senses," I heard my mother say calmly. "She just needs time to think," she added. And Sarah, no longer tearful but smiling, said, "This house would be perfect for us." I rushed out into the hallway and slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking. As I got into the car, my fingers shook so much I could barely insert the key into the ignition. These people, my family, had just tried to take my home away from me, turning my happiest day into a nightmare. The drive home was like a dream, a blur. I replayed the conversation over and over in my head, trying to understand how everything could have turned out so quickly. How could my parents have thought I would willingly give up my home? How could David have sat and agreed while his wife demanded mine? When I returned, my phone began vibrating incessantly, flashing family names. I didn't answer a single call. Then a veritable avalanche of short, cold messages descended on my phone, and I, tired and hot from the journey, didn't want to read them. But curiosity got the better of me. So as soon as I got home, I turned on the screen and saw one after another. From my mother. "Tina, you are acting very selfishly. Family comes first. Call me back." From my father. "Your mother is upset. You need to apologize and do the right thing." From David. "Stop acting like a child. We need to talk about this rationally." From Sarah, a sharp and cold. "I can't believe you put your desires above the needs of your family. Shame on you." And all these messages, like stones, pounded the glass of my phone. I deleted them without replying, hoping quietly, naively, that in a few days the passions would subside and people would understand how unacceptable their behavior was. But I was wrong. The calls and new texts did not stop, and each new wave made me angrier, although there was a strange contrast in the fact that the first weekend after the conflict passed without the usual anxiety. Sarah did not bring Leon and Mateo as usual, and I instantly felt relieved, enjoying the silence in the house, free from the fear that someone would stain the freshly washed floor or break something precious. But that brief peace was interrupted on Tuesday when I was sitting in the office checking estimates and counting materials for clients. and the secretary, blushing slightly, knocked on the door and announced invitingly, "Mom has come to see you." And there was a pang in my chest, because I should have known that she would not back down so easily, and of course I invited her. She walked in with that same smile she remembered from childhood, soft, comfortable, the kind that only appeared when she needed something. She sat down opposite me, folded her hands in her lap, and began to speak quietly, almost in a friendly tone. "I'd like to discuss the situation with the house. I think you're a little hasty." And I, feeling resentment rising in my chest, calmly replied, "Mom, this is my house. I bought it with my own labor and I'm paying for it myself. It's my life." But she, looking around the office where my awards and project photos hung, gently but insistently repeated, as if she were teaching me kindness, "You've achieved great success in business. You can afford another house. Think about David and Sarah. They need space for the children." And I stared at her, reminding myself of the sleepless nights, of how for 9 years in a row I put everything aside, slept little, and drove the same. I drove a battered truck while I paid every penny toward the mortgage. I spoke, quietly and firmly, about how my home was my security and what I'd cared for my entire life. And then she suddenly assumed a familiar pose. Her face tightened, and the words poured out in an icy tone. "You're selfish. Family should help family. You should be generous." And this selfish sounded like a weaponized accusation, as if the desire to preserve the fruits of years of labor made me mean. And when I asked her to leave because I needed peace, she stood up, gathered her purse, and hissed, red with anger, "You're making a big mistake, young lady. This family will not forget how you behaved," and walked out, her heels snorting angrily in the hallway. A week later, the calls started coming from unexpected places. Aunt Carol from out of state, Cousin Mike, whom I hadn't seen in 5 years, Great Uncle Henry, whom I'd only ever met at weddings and funerals, all of them, as if on cue, reminding me of my duty to my family, and a conversation with Aunt Carol, full of sympathy, only confirmed my worst suspicion. My mother had been calling everyone, describing me as cruel and selfish, telling them they'd asked her to ask me to give up the house, and when I asked my cousin if he'd be willing to give up something of his own for other people's children, he simply hung up. Uncle Henry, perhaps embarrassed, muttered that he had to go and hung up. One thing was clear. My mother had carefully turned almost the entire family against me and, like a cunning puppeteer, skillfully transformed the facts into a convenient legend, because she found it easier to combine tears and pity than to admit her mistake. And when I put these pieces together, I couldn't avoid the conclusion that the manipulation was incredible. Another 2 weeks passed, and I almost allowed myself to believe that the storm had subsided, that perhaps they had finally given up, when the calls and endless messages suddenly stopped, and a silence so rare and fragile that I was even afraid to trust it reigned in the house. I began to breathe evenly again, calmly concentrate on work, enjoy strolling through the garden in the evenings, inhaling the scent of roses, and listening to the pond fish playing in the water. It seemed to me that the world was returning to its normal state, that finally I was once again the mistress not only of my home, but of my life. But that feeling didn't last long, because on Saturday morning I was awakened by noise, voices and the hum of motors just outside my bedroom window. At first I thought it was probably one of the neighbors moving or receiving a furniture delivery, but the voices grew louder, closer, and sharper, and a sense of foreboding washed over me. I pulled on a robe and stepped outside, and what met my eyes literally chilled my blood. A huge moving truck was parked in my driveway. 2 workers in gray overalls were unloading boxes and furniture, and Sarah, standing right on my grass as if it were her rightful property, was waving her arms and commanding, "The sofa goes in the living room. Be careful with those boxes, there are the kids' toys in there." Her voice sounded so matter-of-fact, as if everything had been planned and coordinated with me. David stood a little to the side with the boys, Leon and Mateo huddled close to him. confused, with wide eyes, and he, with his arms folded across his chest, looked as if what was happening was the most natural thing in the world. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, my voice shaking, but the words came out sharply. "What the hell is going on here?" Sarah turned to me with that same falsely innocent expression, laced with poorly concealed self-assurance. "Oh, Tina, we're moving. I hope you don't mind that we started early." I was dumbfounded. "Moving? Are you completely crazy?" My voice cracked, but David stepped forward, trying to remain calm. "Tina, don't make a scene. We discussed this. Just let us move our things in, and we'll sort out the details later." I almost laughed with indignation. "We didn't discuss anything." "I told you no. This is my house," I shouted, but Sarah stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a manipulative fire. "Tina, we broke the lease. We have nowhere to go." She called the children. "Leon, Mateo, come here." The boys obediently approached, looking from me to her, confused and frightened. Sarah, with a theatrical sigh, said loudly for everyone to hear, "You can't throw your nephews out on the street, can you?" A smug smile appeared on her face, as if she thought she'd put me in a hopeless situation, but she miscalculated. I turned to the movers and said firmly, clearly, so as to leave no doubt, "Gentlemen, you are on private property without permission. This is trespassing. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police and have you all taken to the station." The workers froze, exchanged glances, and one glanced at David. "Dude, you said this is your sister's apartment and she's okay with it. Does she know?" David hesitated. "Tina, stop being so dramatic." But I shouted, my rage now uncontrollable. "I'm not okay with this. This is my home, and you have no right to be here." The men exchanged glances again. Clearly they'd been through this before. And without a word, they began loading the furniture back into the truck. "No, wait!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical shriek. "Don't listen to her. We paid you. Move it." But the movers obviously understood that getting into such an argument was pointless, and within minutes, everything was back in the truck. Sarah screamed, swore, accused me of selfishness, called me heartless. David stepped closer and grabbed my arm. "Tina, be reasonable. We're your family." I jerked my hand away. "Get off my property now." Sarah, refusing to give in, ran to my front door and began kicking it furiously, screaming about my cruelty and injustice. I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police right now." "You have 30 seconds to leave." The words finally got through to them. David grabbed Sarah's arm forcefully, pulled her away from the door, and herded the children into the car. Sarah continued to shout insults out the window until they disappeared around the corner. Half an hour later, the phone rang again. My parents. I didn't answer. Voicemails followed, one after another, filled with anger, but I didn't even listen, deleting them immediately because I knew I wouldn't hear anything new. That evening, when the sun had already set and a comfortable silence had settled over the house, I received a message from David. As soon as I read the first words, I didn't know whether to be outraged or to laugh, because the text read, "You owe us money for a new apartment. Because of you, we have nowhere to live." I actually laughed out loud, laughed so hard that tears rolled down my cheeks, and only then, having calmed down a bit, did I type a reply. From today on, I won't help you in any way, not a single cent. Sort this out yourself. And after sending it, I felt an incredible sense of relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Of course, more angry messages poured in response, filled with reproaches and accusations, but I didn't even open them. I simply deleted them one after another, determined not to let them poison my life any longer. A couple of weeks passed surprisingly peacefully. I was immersed in work, working on a large landscaping project for a new shopping center, and I enjoyed the fact that in the evenings I could return to my home, to my garden, where peace and harmony reigned. But one evening, as I pulled up to the house and entered the courtyard, my heart literally sank. My beautiful garden was destroyed. The flowers I'd spent years growing were torn out by the roots, the flower beds trampled, the neat flagstone paths torn apart as if a steamroller had rolled over them. Someone with a shovel or some other sharp tool had literally mangled every bed, every arrangement, and I stood amidst this horror, feeling tears welling up. Years of work had been wasted. Everything I'd been so proud of was destroyed. I knew exactly who could have done it, but I needed proof. I rushed to my laptop. A few years ago, after a series of burglaries in our neighborhood, I'd installed cameras around the entire perimeter of the property, and my family hadn't known about it. I opened the footage from that day, and there, as if specially for me, there they were. David and Sarah, absolutely clear as day. The video showed Sarah laughingly pulling out my prize roses, and David frantically tearing up the paths and breaking the plant supports. I downloaded the footage to my phone, got in the car, and drove to my parents' house. I hadn't called ahead. I simply walked into their house where, as usual, the whole family was gathered. My parents, David, Sarah, and the children. "Tina, what are you doing here?" my mother asked in surprise, looking up at me. I noticed Sarah try to hide her triumphant smile. She was clearly enjoying my state. "Someone destroyed my garden today," I said quietly but firmly. Sarah raised her eyebrows theatrically. "Oh no, how awful! There are so many hooligans around these days. You can't even count them." "Yes, there are hooligans," I agreed. "That's exactly why I'm going to the police, especially since I have it all on video." I picked up my phone and started recording. The room was dead silent except for the voices of David and Sarah on the screen, their own laughter and the heavy breathing as they destroyed my property. Their complexions instantly changed, and even the children stopped moving. "I'm going to sue," I said evenly, "and I'll post this video online so everyone can see what kind of people you really are." "Tina, please," my mother folded her hands as if pleading, "don't do this to my family." "Not do what?" I asked. "Not seek justice for the destroyed work? Not expose the truth about what they did?" David finally opened his mouth. "Tina, let's resolve this without the police. We can come to an agreement." "You have exactly 1 week," I said coldly. "Pay me $3,000 for the damages, or I'll file a complaint and publish the footage." "3,000?" Sarah gasped. "We don't have that kind of money." "Then find it," I replied. "You had the funds to break the lease and hire movers. Sort it out yourself." I turned and walked out without another word. Exactly 7 days later, I received a wire transfer from David, $3,000 and a short message. "We never want to see you again." I laughed, as if I wanted to see them myself after all they'd done. Several months had passed since then. I invested the money in restoring the garden, and now it's even more beautiful than before, more fragrant and full of life. My business is growing, bringing in a good income, and peace has finally returned to my soul. I learned from mutual friends that David and his family had moved in with his parents, and now all 6 of us are crammed into a small 3-room house where the cramped conditions, constant squabbles, and Sarah's whims make life unbearable. My parents complain about the expenses. David is nervous. Sarah drives everyone crazy with her demands. But frankly, I don't care anymore. Some evenings I sit in my garden watching the sunset, listening to the birds chirping, and think, how different everything could have been if my family had simply been happy for me, if they had shared in my success instead of trying to take it away. But then I realized that maybe it's even better this way. I prefer to be alone in my home, full of warmth and beauty, than surrounded by those who see me only as a wallet and a source of comfort.